Thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you much, everybody, for coming today to listen to this panel discussion on unidentified anomalous phenomena. And this is indeed one of the most fascinating, one of the most complex, and one of the most important areas of policy today. And this panel discussion came about in some part. I was introduced to Aaron because we are currently working on the first ever Springer Nature peer-reviewed academic volume on UAPs. And my two co-editors for this project are Professor Avi Loeb at Harvard and Professor Gary Nolan at Stanford. And we're inviting many of the top experts from around the world to each write chapters for this book to really produce a definitive peer-reviewed volume on UAPs. And for those of you who aren't familiar with academic publishing, Springer Nature is currently ranked as the most elite academic publisher in Europe, if not the world. So these academic volumes go out to universities around the world to be used for teaching. So this could be used for teaching in multiple subjects, but it really is the creme de la creme of these types of academic volumes. Now, I noted my two co-editors for that book are both scientists. I am actually coming at this from a slightly different perspective. I run a think tank founded by a member of parliament in the UK, and we do various areas of policy ranging from banking reform right through to AI. So, for instance, we organized and moderated the AI roundtable discussions in the European Parliament, those types of projects. So my interest in UAPs really comes from that, looking at this quite objectively using purely evidence-based policy. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is some perspectives on this purely from evidence-based policy. It is absolutely fascinating. But first of all, I just wanted to frame the discussion for a couple of minutes as well. That is, in a sense, frame it by just touching on our place, humanity's place in the universe. And the observable universe is 93 billion light years in diameter. That means it would take an object traveling at the speed of light 93 billion years to traverse the observable universe. The Milky Way, that is our galaxy, is somewhere from 100 billion to 400 billion stars. And there are in the hundreds of billions, certainly, but likely more like up to 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. So that means there's roughly around 100 sextillion stars in the observable universe. Now, when Frank Drake produced his famous Drake equation in 1961, looking at the probability of intelligent life in our galaxy, one of the great unknowns was, I think, the second term in that equation, the number of exoplanets per star out there. We really didn't know. Were there just lots of stars but no exoplanets? But actually now we know the whole universe is indeed plentiful with exoplanets. On average, there's likely at least one, but probably several exoplanets per star across those 100 sextillion or so stars. Now, the next term in Drake's equation was eta Earth. That is the Greek letter eta. So that is the average number of planets in the habitable zone per star. And there's also been a lot of research in recent years on this. So if I quickly touch on some of the most cited peer-reviewed research, Pettigura, Howard, and Marcy in 2013 estimated that 22% of planets orbiting sun-like stars are in the habitable zone. Then a little later, Bryson et al., Steve Bryson works at NASA, used data from the Kepler Space Telescope, and they said a conservative end of the estimate for the number of planets in the habitable zone, just in our galaxy, would be 300 million, but a more optimistic would be into the billions. That was published in the Astronomical Journal. But they actually, for the most part, don't look at red dwarfs. Other researchers such as Dressing and Charbonneau have also estimated that actually red dwarfs, which constitute 3/4 of the stars in our galaxy, can also, in many cases, host habitable planets. But even if we, for a moment, take a very pessimistic position, and say only 1 in a million exoplanets in the observable universe are actually habitable. Out of the 100 sextillion or perhaps septillion or so exoplanets, that still means 100 quadrillion to a quintillion. Now, if we just very quickly think about the rate of abiogenesis, that's the formation of life. Planet Earth is 4.54 billion years old, yet it's actually only really been habitable from around 4.1 billion years ago, and life began somewhere around 3.8 billion years ago, so relatively soon after Earth became habitable. Some of the most peer-reviewed research on abiogenesis then, for instance, from Line, Weaver, and Davis, estimated a 30% probability of life forming on an Earth-like planet on a 600 million year time frame, with 13% probability as a lower bound at 95% confidence. So in other words, it's highly likely that life is forming on many of these quadrillions of habitable planets out there. But very quickly, before I discuss specific UAP instances then, I noted the age of the Earth is 4.54 billion years old, and the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Actually, the average age of planets is around 6.4 billion years. The Earth is relatively youthful. In fact, planet Earth is in the 74th percentile of planets in terms of its youthfulness. So 3/4 of all the other planets in the observable universe have a head start on us, mostly of billions of years. So when you consider that multicellular life on our planet is only 600 million years old, and then for a moment, if you think about how much humanity has evolved just since the mid-19th century, only around 175 years ago or so, if you wanted to get a message from Europe to America, someone had to cross the Atlantic to deliver that message. People were still riding on horseback and lighting their homes using candles. And now, just 175 years later, look how much we've evolved. So think how much we might evolve if we don't destroy ourselves in 10,000 years, or 1,000,000 years, or perhaps even 1 billion years. So I just thought I would frame that discussion today, because just talking about these things like ideas, like life in other parts of the universe is certainly not an absurdity by any standards. So then, if we consider some of these unidentified anomalous phenomena, what indeed are we talking about here? Well, from the point of view of trying to formulate some kind of evidence-based policy, what we're really looking for is multiple sensors using different forms of technology, plus multiple credible eyewitnesses as well. Now, the classic case of this in recent years is the so-called Tic Tac encounter, which happened in November 2004 off the coast of Southern California. And in this instance, the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group was stationed there. And the USS Princeton saw a UAP flying around on their radar. And this happened for around 2 weeks. And they would send out jets to investigate, and the UAP would fly off incredibly quickly. Then finally they sent out 2 jets which caught up with the UAP. They closed in on it and saw it with their infrared sensors. And then they also saw it visually. And they described it as 40-foot long, smooth and white, hence the Tic Tac description. They said it reacted when approached, and it accelerated extremely quickly without any visible propulsion. It also engaged in active interference with their radar, and they said there was no sonic boom when the UAPs sped away. So this is what we would look for in terms of evidence. There is radar plus infrared plus visual confirmation as well. Multiple eyewitnesses, radar operator testimony, additional witnesses there, and a coherent narrative between all of these people. So this actually makes me think of a quote from the physicist Michio Kaku, who has taken an interest in UAPs in recent years. And he said, quote, "In the old days, the burden of proof was on the true believers. Now the burden of proof has shifted. Now it's the military that has to prove that these aren't extraterrestrial objects." And indeed, the evidence for some of these cases is is very strong. Two similar incidents to the Tic Tac incident were the Gimbal and Go Fast incidents, which happened by the USS Theodore Roosevelt off the coast of Florida in 2014 and 2015. In that case, there were several UAPs flying around on radar, and one of the pilots sent out described it as, quote, a whole fleet of them. But actually, these types of sightings from fighter pilots go back several decades, at least to World War II. In World War II, pilots from all the major powers, the US, Britain, Germany, the Soviet Union, Japan, and indeed pilots from other countries as well, all described UAPs flying alongside them and engaging with them in the way that they were maneuvering, and then they would suddenly fly off. And these, in the West, among the Allies, these became known as Foo Fighters. And each side at the time thought that these were some kind of secret weapons being developed by their enemies. The Germans thought they were weapons being developed by the Allies, and vice versa. These similar sightings, though, are not all based around military contexts. Another incident happened, for instance, with Japan Airlines in 1986, where a UAP flew alongside a commercial airliner for around 50 minutes or so, and was visible both on radar and also visually. And then there was also the Aguadilla UAP incident in 2013, where this was near Rafael Hernandez Airport, and US Customs and Border Protection saw this on their radar. And when the jets went out to investigate, in this case, the UAP was actually transmedium. So it was flying through the air, and then it quickly flew underwater at a velocity which would destroy any human-known technology, of course, due to the difference in density between the air and the water. Now, I want to talk about another related area of UAP activity, which is important for policymaking, and that is UAP's interaction with nuclear weapons systems, which also goes back a long time in terms of the records. And there have been numerous cases, dozens of cases at least, of this occurring around strategic nuclear forces bases, both in the US and in other countries as well. One instance of this was at Malmstrom in 1967, where a UAP was visible on radar and then apparently also visually by all accounts. And then all 10 missiles in echo flight at Malmstrom lost strategic alert within 10 seconds of each other. They went into, quote, no-go condition. So these missiles were no longer operable. And then when the UAP left, they regained their usability. Then a year later at Minot Air Force Base, a similar episode happened in 1968 with a B-52. In this instance, the radio communications of the B-52 were also rendered unusable when the UAP was flying around it. Now, another perhaps more interesting case happened in November 1975, where this actually went on for 3 weeks, with UAPs flying around 5 different nuclear weapons bases. And this happened at Loring, Wurtsmith, Malmstrom, Minot, and Canadian Forces Station at Falconbridge, Ontario. And in this instance, security option 3 was implemented. That's the highest security alert for nuclear weapons bases. And this was applied simultaneously across the entire northern tier. And the Commander-in-Chief of NORAD formally documented this in an official message to NORAD units. And when we look at testimony from some of the pilots involved during these encounters in 1975 around these nuclear bases, they are actually remarkably similar to some of these more modern accounts from the USS Nimitz and some of the others that I mentioned earlier. The pilots would describe UAPs that would interact with them as they were flying in the way they would maneuver around them. and then they would then accelerate away very quickly. And it's also worth noting people working in these nuclear weapons bases go through what's called personnel reliability program. So this is some of the most stringent personality testing, which is ongoing. So the people working at these bases are certainly not prone to fantasies or delusions. Another instance of UAPs and nuclear bases occurred in the Soviet Union in 1982, where a UAP was flying around a nuclear base in Ukraine, and in this instance, perhaps more ominously, by all accounts, missiles temporarily entered an activation sequence for launch, and this, of course, caused significant concern from all the people there. But when the UAP departed, those missiles then ceased their activation sequence. And there is actually, in one of the nuclear treaties, in the 1971 nuclear treaty between the US and Soviet Union, Article 3 does actually mention this. It actually says, and I'll quote the whole thing, the parties undertake to notify each other immediately in the event of detection by missile warning systems of unidentified objects, or in the event of signs of interference with these systems or with related communications facilities, if such occurrences could create a risk of outbreak of nuclear war between the two countries. There's one more recent analysis then worth looking at, which was done by some academics in France in 2015, and they looked at a lot of UAP-related incidents, and they also found that they have tended to cluster around bases with nuclear weapons. Now, today, as I noted, I want to speak predominantly about UAP encounters which are useful and important directly for evidence-based policy, which we can talk about here at the OAS. But it's also worth mentioning, if you are interested in other forms of encounters, let's say, some to look at would be Rangeley in the UK, where there was indeed a closer encounter with a UAP, by all accounts. Also the Ariel School in Zimbabwe and the Westall School in Australia. So given that then, thinking of this in terms of the evidence that we're looking at and what this means, what does this indicate in terms of policy? Well, if we think for a moment about what the Organization of American States can do, actually the OAS could serve as a model for other regions in this instance, just as it has with election monitoring and also cyber security. So some of the things that the OAS could implement would be, first of all, to establish an OAS UAP working group. And again, this would not have to say anything about the potential for quote-unquote non-human intelligence. This could span aviation safety, national security, and scientific investigation, for instance. But a UAP working group, multilateral, under the auspices of the OAS would be very useful. But then also, next would be to mandate standardized member state reporting. So in other words, a common taxonomy and reporting protocol for UAP incidents. Now, given the complexity and heterogeneity of the different types of UAP incidents, this can actually be incredibly useful in and of itself, especially when you're dealing with different countries. Third, then, security assessment could be done through the OAS, which again could be completely threat agnostic. So three potential explanations advanced for these phenomena are adversarial human technology, unknown natural phenomena, and non-human intelligence. But of course, a threat agnostic security assessment would not have to be based on any one of those three hypotheses. So it actually brings forth a quote from John Ratcliffe, who was Director of National Intelligence, and he said, I think it was in 2021, he said, "We are talking about objects that have been seen by Navy or Air Force pilots or picked up by satellite imagery that frankly engage in actions that are difficult to explain, movements that are hard to replicate, that we don't have the technology for, or traveling at speeds that exceed the sound barrier without a sonic boom. So again, if ever there was a series of incidents that were in need of a security assessment, that is surely it, whatever the possible explanations are. And then fourth and finally, ideally this OAS UAP working group would also include a public-facing summary, not just a classified report to defense ministries. Now, I understand, given much of what we're talking about here, the need for a certain degree of secrecy, and I'm not naive about these things, of course, but nevertheless, what we're discussing here is not just of interest from the perspective of security or aviation safety and that kind of thing. This is also of great interest for humanity as a whole. Therefore, any OAS working group should really include a public-facing summary for all of its reports as well, which should include really as much as possible to help people understand what these UAPs in fact are. So I hope that has given everybody a good outline to what we're dealing with and some of the policy options here for the OAS. And as I noted, this Spring and Nature volume we're working on will come out probably around this time next year, the first ever peer-reviewed Spring and Nature volume on UAPs. So thank you very much, everybody.